In 1992,
He was a rifleman. Now Chuck Connor's secrets come to light. He once lifted the leader of the Soviet Union off the ground in a bear hug on a runway in front of television cameras from around the world. That leader was Leonid Brezhnev. The man holding him was not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a politician. He was a television cowboy, a former minor league first baseman who never lasted a full season in the majors, a backup center who broke a backboard before he ever became famous. By the time he died in 1992, Chuck Connors had done something almost no one else in Hollywood history had managed. He had played professional baseball, played professional basketball, starred in one of the most beloved family westerns ever made, become a genuine friend of Soviet premier during the coldest years of the Cold War, and played one of the most chilling villains ever put on American television. This is the real story of how a poor kid from Brooklyn became Lucas McCain, and how his life turned out to be just as unlikely as anything he ever did on screen. He was born Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors on April 10th, 1921, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents had come from Newfoundland, and they settled into a working-class stretch of Brooklyn where money was always tight. His father worked the docks as a longshoreman, hauling freight for hours at a time, and his mother kept the household running through the hardest years of the Great Depression. There was nothing glamorous about the Connors household. What there was in abundance was sport. Kevin, or Chuck as he'd later be known, spent every free hour he had at the local boys' club, and it was there that a lifelong obsession took hold: the Brooklyn Dodgers. He didn't just want to watch them. He wanted to wear the uniform. That dream nearly stayed just a dream, the way it does for most kids from a neighborhood like his. But Chuck had something scouts noticed early: size, coordination, and a competitive streak that didn't quit. His talent earned him a scholarship to Adelphi Academy, a private school that gave him a shot most of his neighborhood friends never got. He made the most of it, starring in baseball, basketball, football, and track, and by the time he graduated, more than 24 colleges were trying to recruit him. He chose Seton Hall, where he played both basketball and baseball, and it was on a New Jersey diamond that he picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Playing first base, he had a habit of calling out to the pitcher to throw the ball to him, and Chuck It To Me got shortened, the way nicknames do, until Kevin Connors simply became Chuck. College didn't get to run its course. In 1942, with the country fully committed to fighting World War II, Chuck enlisted in the Army. He trained at Fort Knox and was eventually assigned as a tank instructor, a job that kept him stateside rather than sending him overseas. He later served at West Point, and in one of those strange footnotes that makes his life read like fiction, he personally trained two of the year's most famous college football players, Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, the backfield duo known as Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside, who went on to help Army win back-to-back national championships. Even in uniform, Chuck couldn't stay away from athletics. In his off hours, he played basketball in a professional league and kept his baseball swing sharp with semi-pro games around Brooklyn. He was discharged in 1946, and almost immediately, professional sports came calling again, only this time in a way that would make him a genuine piece of sports trivia. That fall, Chuck joined the Boston Celtics for the franchise's very first season. He stood 6'5", and he played forward and center over 49 games, averaging a modest but respectable few points a night. His best outing came in mid-December of 1946, when he dropped 15 points in a tight win over the Providence Steamrollers. He also did something no professional basketball player had ever done before him. During warm-ups before the Celtics' first home game, Chuck Connors shattered a backboard. It's a claim that sounds almost too colorful to be true, but it's one of the most repeated and well-documented facts about his early career, decades before anyone had heard the name Shaquille O'Neal or Darryl Dawkins in connection with broken glass. His basketball career, though, didn't last. By February of 1947, only months into his Celtics tenure, Chuck walked away from the NBA's earliest incarnation to chase the dream that had never left him: playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Baseball did not make it easy on him. He got his shot with the Dodgers on May 1st, 1949, appearing in what would be his only major league game for the team that had shaped his entire childhood. It did not go the way he'd imagined. He grounded into a double play, and the Dodgers lost. Rather than fold, Chuck spent years grinding through the minor leagues, bouncing from team to team, refusing to let one bad afternoon define him. He resurfaced in the majors in 1951 with the Chicago Cubs, playing 66 games and hitting a pair of home runs against the New York Giants that season, one in July and one in August. When his major league career finally wound down, his career batting average sat at .238, a perfectly ordinary number for a journeyman ballplayer. But what Chuck did with the years that followed baseball is where his story stops being ordinary at all. He remains one of only 13 men in history to have played both in Major League Baseball and in the earliest days of the NBA, a distinction that has nothing to do with acting and everything to do with sheer physical talent. It was baseball, fittingly, that led him into show business. In 1952, Chuck was playing first base for the Los Angeles Angels, a minor league club, and his career in the sport that had defined his youth was quietly reaching its end. But a game in Los Angeles put him in front of exactly the right audience. His size and his rugged, weathered look caught the eye of people in the film industry who had started scouting ballplayers for their look as much as their swing. He was encouraged to try a screen test, and almost on a whim, he did. The test went well enough that MGM signed him within days. It's the kind of Hollywood origin story that sounds invented, a ballplayer walking off the field and into a studio contract in the span of a week, but it's exactly what happened. His first role was small, a police captain in the 1952 comedy Pat and Mike, starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, two of the biggest names in the business. For a former athlete with zero formal training, sharing a set with Tracy and Hepburn on his very first job was a baptism by fire. Over the next several years, Chuck worked constantly, taking whatever roles came his way and building a resume across both film and the still young medium of television. He appeared alongside John Wayne in Trouble Along the Way, alongside Gregory Peck and Charlton Heston in The Big Country, and in 1957 he landed the role that changed everything, Bernie Sanderson in Disney's Old Yeller. The film was a massive hit, and it put Chuck's face and his particular brand of rugged warmth in front of a huge family audience for the first time. Producers casting a new Western series for television took notice, and they thought Chuck had exactly the presence they needed for their lead. At first, he turned them down. The money on the table was less than he was already making. It took a better offer and the promise of a small ownership stake in the show itself to get him to say yes. That decision would define the rest of his life. Before a single frame was shot, Chuck threw himself into preparation. He wasn't a natural horseman, so he trained until he was. He worked with a firearms expert named Rod Redwing to master a signature move, cocking and spinning a modified Winchester rifle in one fluid motion. The gun itself was custom-built for the show, with an oversized lever loop that let Chuck spin it dramatically and a rigged trigger mechanism that let his character fire off shots in rapid succession, faster than any standard lever-action rifle actually could. He practiced the spins so many times that his hands blistered, but he refused to fake it on camera. When The Rifleman premiered on September 30th, 1958, more than 14 million households tuned in for the first episode, an enormous number for the era. What set the show apart wasn't the gunplay, even though the gunplay became iconic in its own right and inspired real toy versions from Winchester. It was the relationship at the center of the story. Lucas McCain wasn't a lone gunslinger drifting from town to town. He was a widowed father raising his young son Mark, played by Johnny Crawford, alone on a ranch in the New Mexico territory. Television in the late 1950s rarely put a single father front and center, and audiences responded to it in a way the network hadn't fully anticipated. Episodes wrestled with real parenting dilemmas dressed up in Western clothing. How much to protect a child from danger, how to model self-control when anger would be easier, how to let a son grow into his own judgment. Chuck didn't just act the part. Behind the scenes, he became genuinely involved in shaping it, sitting on writers' meetings, pitching storylines, and pushing back when he felt a script made Lucas McCain too flawless. He wanted McCain to make mistakes, to carry real weight, because he believed a man who never seemed to hesitate before pulling a rifle wasn't a hero worth watching. The show ran for 5 seasons and 168 episodes, and decades later it still airs in reruns and still draws an audience, particularly among longtime fans who grew up with it the first time around. When the show ended in 1963, Chuck ran straight into a problem that has ended plenty of careers before and since. He had become so thoroughly identified with one character that audiences and casting directors alike struggled to see him as anyone else. He pushed back hard against the idea of returning to more Westerns, reportedly turning down a string of Western pilot offers in the years right after The Rifleman ended, hoping to prove his range. It didn't pay off the way he wanted. A stiff, buttoned-up banker role opposite Doris Day and James Garner in Move Over, Darling didn't change many minds. Even in non-Western auditions, he kept hearing the same note. He read as too Western. For a stretch in the mid-1960s, by his own account, he seriously considered walking away from acting entirely and going back to professional sports. Instead, he found two projects that let him show a different side of himself. In Arrest and Trial, which ran from 1963 to 1964, he played a defense attorney in a show that split each episode between a police investigation and a courtroom drama, trading his cowboy hat for a suit and tie. Critics responded well to the change of pace, even though the show itself only lasted a single season. In 1965, he returned to the Western genre, but not to safe, familiar ground. In Branded, he played Jason McCord, a cavalry officer wrongly branded a coward and drummed out of the army, spending each episode trying to clear his name. It gave him a more layered, more emotionally complicated character than Lucas McCain had ever been, and the show ran for 2 seasons. It was more than a decade later that Chuck delivered what many considered the most powerful performance of his career. In 1977, he took on a role of Tom Moore in Roots, the landmark miniseries that traced generations of an African-American family from enslavement forward through American history. Chuck played a plantation owner, a role built entirely on cruelty, and it stood in stark contrast to every warm-hearted, protective father figure audiences had known him as for 2 decades. Roots became a genuine television event, watched by tens of millions of Americans for its finale, and Chuck's performance earned him an Emmy nomination, recognition for an actor willing to step completely outside the image that had made him famous in the first place. In the years after, he kept working steadily, picking up guest spots on shows like Fantasy Island and Murder, She Wrote, taking a memorably creepy turn as a wax museum owner in the low-budget horror film Tourist Trap, and even squaring off against extraterrestrials in a science fiction B-movie. None of it carried the cultural weight of The Rifleman or Roots, but it showed a working actor who never stopped taking the job seriously, however strange the job happened to be. Now here's where Chuck Connor's story stops looking like a typical Hollywood career and starts looking like something out of Cold War fiction. The Rifleman had a fan nobody in Hollywood could have predicted: Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Somehow, reruns of Chuck's Western had made it onto Soviet television, one of the only American shows to be broadcast there during a period when relations between Washington and Moscow were tense and cautious at best. Brezhnev reportedly loved it, and word of that fandom eventually made its way back to the United States. In June 1973, Brezhnev traveled to California as part of a historic visit, and President Richard Nixon hosted a gathering for him at his Western White House in San Clemente. Chuck was on the guest list, and when the two men were introduced, Brezhnev immediately recognized him, not as a fellow statesman or a business contact, but as the actor from his favorite television show. Chuck gave the Soviet leader a pair of Colt single-action revolvers and showed him how to twirl them, cowboy style, and Brezhnev was visibly delighted. The moment that made headlines around the world came the next day, as Brezhnev was boarding his plane to head home. He spotted Chuck among the crowd, seeing him off, walked back over, and pulled the 6'5" actor into a bear hug, so enthusiastic that Chuck briefly lifted the Soviet premier clean off his feet. Photographs of the embrace ran in newspapers across the globe, an image that captured something genuinely strange and human cutting through decades of Cold War posturing. The friendship didn't end with a photo op. Brezhnev invited Chuck to visit the Soviet Union as his personal guest, and that December, Chuck did exactly that, spending roughly 2 weeks in Moscow as a guest of the Soviet government. Nearly a decade later, when Brezhnev died in November 1982, Chuck asked the White House if he could join the official American delegation traveling to Moscow for the funeral. He was turned down. The delegation was kept small, limited to Vice President George Bush, Secretary of State George Shultz, and the American ambassador. It's a detail that would be a strange enough footnote on its own, but there's a stranger one still. 10 years later, to the exact day, on November 10th, Chuck Connors himself passed away, on the same calendar date as the Soviet leader who once lifted his hand in friendship on an airport tarmac in California.